Hello, I'm Alex Stock. I am the director of the Thompson Center on Public Leadership. Um, Welcome to this event on pipeline to candidacy. We're glad you joined us today. We have sort of an exciting lineup of speakers, and this is the first event in sort of a two-event series. This one on why people run for office and how to encourage people to run for office and related questions. And the second on the effectiveness of legislators in office. This event is co-sponsored by the Elections Research Center here at the University of Wisconsin. And so with that said, I will turn it over to Barry Burden, the director of the uh, Elections Research Center.
Thanks, Alex. Hi, everyone, and welcome again. I am Barry Burden, Director of the Elections Research Center. We are a nonpartisan institute here at UW-Madison focused on social science research to understanding and improving elections in the US and around the world. So the discussion today very much fits with our mission. You're going to see me in the second part of today's program, but in the first part of the program, I'm going to hand over the reins yet again to another speaker. That's my colleague, Ellie Powell. Ellie is an associate professor of political science here at UW and also on the Elections Research Center Steering Committee. She's an expert in the US Congress in particular and has done research on money and politics, understanding political parties, congressional representation, and is widely published in academic journals on those topics. We're going to keep all introductions relatively brief today because we have so much material and expertise we want to pack in. So with that, over to you, Ellie.
Great, thanks so much, Barry. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce this all-star panel talking about recruiting and training women for public office. We're going to start out with an discussion among some academics who are the leading experts on research on this topic. And then we're going to shift gears and talk to some of the amazing leaders who are actually running these recruitment and training programs. So we have these three academics who are going to be talking about some of their research. First, we have Jennifer Lawless. She's the Leone, Reeves, and George Spice Professor of Politics at the University of Virginia, as well as the co-editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Political Science, which is one of the top journals in the field of political science. She's the author of 7 books, including 2 particularly relevant to our discussion today: Women on the Run, Gender, Media, and Political Campaigns in a Polarized Era with Danny Hayes, and It Still Takes a Candidate, Why Women Don't Run for Office with Richard Fox. She's also one of the rare political scientists with experience running for office herself. In 2006, she ran for the US House of Representatives in Rhode Island's 2nd Congressional District. We also have joining us Jamil Scott. Jamil is an assistant professor of government at Georgetown University. Professor Scott's research focuses particularly on women of color, when and why they run for office, and when do they succeed. Her work on these topics has been published in the National Review of Black Politics, Politics Groups and Identities, among many other outlets. And then finally, we're going to be joined by Shauna Shames. Shauna is an associate professor of political science at Rutgers Camden and the program director of gender studies. Her research focuses on gender, race, LGBTQ plus politics, and political ambition, and she's published extensively on those topics of particular relevance for our discussion today. She's the author of a book, Out of the Running: Why Millennials Reject Political Careers and Why It Matters, and recently co-edited a book on Good Reasons to Run: Women and Political Candidacy. So to kick off our discussion, Jen is going to talk about her recent research on this.
Great, thank you very much. I'm very excited to speak with you today. Let's see if I'm technologically able to share my screen. Did it work? Yes? Okay, it says participants can see my screen. Okay, so 20 years ago, Richard Fox and I decided that there seemed to be this fundamental puzzle in American politics, which was that study after study was indicating that when women ran for office, they were just as likely as men to win. They were just as able to raise money. And in recent years, actually, there's even little evidence of any sort of systematic bias on the campaign trail from the media. Yet at the time, and even still today, women are significantly underrepresented in US political institutions. So what we decided was to launch a study of political ambition, because our hunch was that it wasn't that voters were unwilling to elect women or donors were unwilling to give to women. It was that women were not putting themselves out there and running for office in the first place. And we wanted to determine if that was actually the case, because if that was the case, we could come up with some steps to close that gender gap. And so in 2001, we launched the first study of potential candidates. This was a national survey of more than 4,000 lawyers, business leaders, educators, and political activists. Those are the 4 professions that are most likely to lead to state legislative and congressional careers. And we basically asked people, have you ever considered running for office? Has anybody ever suggested that you run? Do you think you're qualified? We then, in 2008, resurveyed those same people to see if their ambition had changed over time. Those were the results, and it still takes a candidate why women don't run for office. In 2011, which was exactly 10 years after we launched the first study, we did another national survey of potential candidates. We summarized the results in this report called Men Rule, where we wanted to see if a new generation felt the same way about politics. And basically what we found was that there was a substantial gender gap in political ambition. If we just asked people, have you ever thought about running for office? In the 2001 results, almost 60% of men had considered it. This is any office, but only 43% of women had, for a 16 percentage point gender gap. A decade later, in 2011, the results look very much the same. But life has significantly changed since then. So we just, in November of 2021, launched the most recent study of the gender gap in political ambition. Again, lawyers, business leaders, educators, and political activists, national sample of several thousand of them. Keep in mind, we have a political environment now that doesn't even resemble what it did 20 years ago in terms of women's presence in politics. So let me show you the gender gap in political ambition. Now that you all want to sigh and cry, let me highlight that it's actually worse than this looks. It's not only that the gender gap in ambition has stayed roughly the same size, but it doesn't matter if we measure the gender gap in political ambition in other ways, it's just as pathetic. So men are twice as likely as women to report that they've seriously considered a candidacy. They're twice as likely to say that they're open to running for office in the future. And notably, this is true for both local and federal offices. So it's not just that women are out there thinking, oh, I couldn't run for Congress or I couldn't be president of the United States. They're also significantly less likely than men on all of the local offices and all of the state legislative offices, all of the statewide offices, to say the same thing. So from school board to president of the United States, we're uncovering a substantial gender gap in political ambition. Now, one of the roots of this gender gap in political ambition is this qualifications gap. We ask people, do you think you're qualified to run for office? And note here that more than 70% of men self-assess as qualified or very qualified. That's certainly not the case for women. When we look there, we're seeing only a total of 48%. And what I want to underscore is that in terms of professional background, educational credentials, income, all of the kinds of factors that would actually lead somebody to have objective qualifications, there are no differences. In other words, if I were to show you their resumes, you wouldn't be able to determine who was a man and who was a woman. They look exactly the same, but they're not perceiving themselves the same way. The same thing is true when it comes to the political recruitment gap. We asked people if anybody had ever suggested that they run. Had they ever received the suggestion to run from a formal political actor, like an elected official, a political activist, or a party leader? Had they ever received the suggestion or the nudge to run from a personal connection, like a family member, colleague, friend, member of the clergy? And here too, even though it's 2021, we're uncovering substantial gender differences in terms of whether anybody has received this suggestion to run. And what's really important to keep in mind here is that this suggestion to run matters a lot. Now, we asked people, this is a new series of questions, we asked people if they thought they'd definitely be more likely to consider running under various circumstances. And the most important factor here would be if a representative from the Democratic or the Republican Party encouraged them to run. We see that both men and women say that that's the most important factor. So just remember, when we go back here to the formal political actor, that's the factor that matters the most. And it's a factor where women are still at a disadvantage. Importantly, an email from a political organization that informs you that somebody submitted your name as an excellent potential candidate is the next important thing. And here, this is why I think we have some good news. There are political organizations already doing this. You're going to hear from some of them today. The key is that this message be very, very targeted. It can't just be a general idea like, oh, we need more women in politics. It can't be an elected official making a broad speech saying we need more people like you to run for office. People want to know that there's actually somebody out there that thinks they would be a good candidate. Now, the reason that I find all of this really fascinating is that the gender gaps in political recruitment, the gender gaps in self-perceived qualifications, and the gender gaps in political ambition look very, very similar to the way that they did in 2001. Yet so much has changed since 2001. The number of women serving in Congress has actually doubled. Hillary Clinton, Sarah Palin, Nancy Pelosi, Kamala Harris all broke glass ceilings. Women's organizations have prioritized recruiting women to run for office. There's more attention to women's underrepresentation. Women's marches are out there. And the Me Too movement has also called attention to the fact that our political institutions have to be more responsive to women. Yet despite all of those macro level changes, we come back to the fact that the gender gap in political ambition hasn't really changed. And I want to end on this point because we've come a long way in 20 years in terms of generating more equitable representation. Our political institutions, no doubt, are more diverse. When you look at the US Congress now, when you look at state legislatures, city halls, although women are still underrepresented, the numbers of women serving are, volumes greater than they were in 2001 and even 2011. We've had record numbers of women on both sides of the political aisle run for office in the last several election cycles. But the reality is that overall, when we step away from individual women running for specific offices for which they've been recruited, like the US Congress, when we step away from the fact that there are, individuals who are going to say to somebody, oh, you should run at this particular time. The overall idea of throwing your hat into the ring is something that most men who have this kind of background think about doing, and most women do not. And I'd argue that if we're going to say that we're a democratically legitimate government, if we're going to say that we actually care about notions of simple justice, then something seems fundamentally wrong with a political system where we still have a situation where women just don't think of politics as an area that they should consider. Now, if women decide systematically that they don't want to run for office and they'd rather channel that energy into something else, that's a different question, and those are a different set of challenges. But if it's not showing up on their radar screen in the first place, then I think that's something that we have to be really cognizant of. And the one thing that I'll leave you with here is, I've long said that if political actors really cared about this, if the DNC and the RNC really, really wanted to make sure that we had gender parity, it's not that difficult to identify one well-qualified woman in every congressional district around the country, encourage her to run and support her candidacy, which means that gender parity in our political institutions is not contingent on closing the gender gap in political ambition. But democratic legitimacy is, and I think that's where we really need to focus our efforts. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jen. Shauna, can you kick us off next?
Okay, you can hear me? So, oh God, Jen, I was really hoping you were going to give us some better news. You said you have new results from the 2021 survey. This is very depressing, actually. So let me see if I can say anything from my research that might help us further explain. And I just wanted to, first of all, thank Jen. She is the trailblazer in this research. And I'm so excited to hear what you're doing now, although depressing, bummer. So this is my research. I try to follow somewhat in Jen's footsteps. Let's see. I have to share the screen. Okay, everybody can see that. So I did a project starting in about 2012, and I was doing a lot of interviews, trying to figure out among a sample of people kind of somewhat upstream of Jen's adult professional sample. I was looking at graduate students in elite law and policy schools who had already kind of made some decision that would make them a good candidate. So I was looking at law and policy specifically. And these were elite schools. I was looking at Harvard schools and Suffolk Law School to try to figure out what did these young people, but who are already clearly interested in politics and policy, what did they think about politics and running for office? And I started by asking some of the interviewees questions like, do you know what the current percentage of women in Congress is? And of course, nobody likes to say that they don't know something. So I had one guy who gave such an interesting answer. He kind of hemmed and hawed, and he finally ended up by saying, well, I know it's not where it should be. And that intrigued me. So I said, where should it be? And he said, well, let's put it like this. I think it would be really cool if I could walk into a room of my elected representatives and not have the first thought that came into my head be, whoa, that's a lot of white dudes. So I call that the Matt test. By Matt's proposed test, we are currently failing. Jen has given us kind of some of this information, but just visually, I think this is a useful visualization of where we are in terms of the most recent kind of setup here. What we are seeing is kind of continued overrepresentation of white men in particular. And I like that framing of it. If you look over time, it becomes even more stark, and we see the great weight of history that kind of really makes having women unusual, right? So this may be one reason in her work, Jen talks about a masculinized political environment. You can see it here for sure. It's also an extremely white political environment that we've had for this country's history, such that women of color in particular, and I know Jamil will talk more about this, but women of color in particular often don't feel welcome in politics, and even sometimes are challenged about whether they are in fact citizens. These are the 4 congresswomen who former President Trump told to go back to their own countries, right? Who are all citizens. And this is maybe my most favorite picture of kind of, faces at a press conference. I think that's terrific. And we know that this matters. We know that representation has a huge effect on the psychological connection that citizens have to politics in terms of both race and gender. So in my own work, I was trying to figure out 2 factors, but in the Out of the Running book, I started with the psychology factor. What can we figure out about what's in people's minds about running for office, including, as Jen talked about, the qualifications and what they would need to run, and also whether they feel like politics is a good place for them or where they can get something done that they want to see. I also, if I manage to do this right and save some time, I also want to tell you about a more recent project, which is about the structural side, as in women and people of color face different structural disadvantages, particularly socioeconomically, that make it much harder to run as candidates. So let me start by talking about, this is my 2017 book. This was based on that survey and that project about kind of elite graduate students. So what did young, really well-qualified millennials who were already interested in politics and policy and could be great candidates, why did most of them not have high political ambition? Why was that political ambition greatly skewed also by race and gender? So this is the different ways that I looked at that in the chapters. I promise I won't go through them all. But consider this, the red bars are the men, the orange are the women. This is a sample of about 800 highly qualified, brilliant, graduate students at Harvard Kennedy School, Harvard Law School, Suffolk Law School. And I asked them, would you describe yourself as ambitious? About 93% of the sample overall said they would. And there was no significant gender gaps or racial gaps in describing yourself as ambitious. This was also a sample that had a lot of experience as high school students in student government. So it's not that these people have never thought about politics. And in fact, overall, the women had been more active in high school government than had the men, right? No significant racial or ethnic gaps there either. But I found just what Jen has found in her samples, nowhere near equal political ambition. And then when I looked at this by gender plus race in terms of an intersectional lens, it was women of color as a group that were particularly not interested in running for office. The Black women somewhat more, had somewhat more seriously thought about it. But also when I talked to them in interviews, were much more likely to have rejected it, even if they thought seriously about it. So I found significant gender plus racial gaps in who had thought seriously of running for office, and in terms of the psychology, not just in who thought they were qualified, which I did find and Jen has found, but also in who thought politics was worth going into and whether they could do something good with their life and for the world by going into politics. And in that particular regard, in terms of does politics solve problems, it was Black women who were least likely to believe that politics could solve the problems they most cared about. So I set this up as a kind of comparison of costs and benefits of running for office, because when I started doing the interviews, I heard a whole lot of really reasonable, thoughtful, and rational comments about how costly it was to run for office, right? In terms of you have to raise the money, you may have to suffer yourself financially to do this. You certainly suffer in terms of time, that even if you were elected, there may be a lot of gridlock so that it would impair your ability to get things done. That the kind of acrimony involved in a political campaign can be emotionally upsetting, can really take a toll on people. The hyper partisanship, polarized politics is certainly a psychological turnoff. The idea that the media would invade people's privacy, and I think this has only gotten worse with everybody with a cell phone is a journalist now, and every corner of your life being looked into. So I found a lot of kind of resistance to the idea of invasion of privacy, hyperpartisanship, as I talked about, and the question of whether or not you thought you could do something good, right? Could running for office do good things? And there was a wide variety of opinion on that, and it was not gender neutral, right? Women were less likely to believe politics could solve important problems, or that if they got elected, they could do something good and be listened to and do something useful on an issue. So I set this up as a cost reward framework, and I did this kind of for each individual in the survey as an index of add up all these costs, add up all these rewards. The total kind of score somebody could get was their rewards that they saw minus the cost that it would take to run. Some of the other costs I should mention included things like, do you perceive there's advantage for a white male candidate? Do you think Barack Obama was treated equally by the news media? So on the whole, again here, men are the red and women are the orange. On the whole, women, and especially women of color, were very conscious of discrimination. And even though Jen is totally right, we don't find actual evidence, or certainly not systematic evidence of discrimination. But I do find that women, and especially women of color, are highly attuned to it and think they will face it, right? So that if you think about the perceptions that they're working under, they are absolutely expecting to face discrimination. And I think that's a large deterrent to their candidacy. This is a kind of an overall distribution across the costs and rewards scale. So that's one index. If you saw greater rewards than costs, you got a positive score. If you saw greater costs than rewards, you would get a negative score. And most people hovered right around that 0 line. But the interesting thing to me was that the mean for women was slightly behind the 0 line, and was statistically significantly different than the mean for men, which was a little bit in front of the 0 line. So the first thing that I noted in the book is that most people seem to be pretty deterred from running for office. Even the white men I talked to did not see more rewards than costs. It didn't seem all that worth it. But the women were more deterred, and the women of color the most. And you can see the difference in the tails. The tails would absolutely be the place where you would most likely see people running for office, as in those who see all costs, all rewards and almost no costs were disproportionately men. If you look at it in terms of the distribution of the sample in these, I felt like I had to do a 2x2 box here.
Running a little late on time.
Okay, yeah, let me just finish here. The people who were most likely to see, we figure those who saw highest rewards would be most likely to run, lowest cost, highest rewards in that upper right-hand box, and the lower left would be least likely to run. And that was, again, highly skewed by both race and gender. I'll save this for the end, but if anybody wants to hear more about the structural factors, the latest research I've been doing is looking not just about the psychological picture people have in their mind about running, but also we found that women who are breadwinners, as in earning the majority of income for their family, especially single moms, even if they have been trained as candidates, they are far less likely to run.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Shauna. Jamil, can you take it away?
Sure. Hello, everyone. And it is great to be preceded by Jennifer Lawless and Shauna Shames, who are just great scholars that I admire. And so I won't belabor the point on the important work that they've talked about in terms of women being underrepresented in Congress more generally and in state legislatures, or rather in politics more generally, rather, I should say. What I want to do is kind of give you an outlook at the state level. That's the story I've largely been thinking about myself, right? And that story, I think, largely is one that speaks to not folks who have not thought about running, but the ones who are. And so, what I want to bring your attention to is that it's expensive to run, right? If we think about the shift from 2008 to 2018, there's a lot of money being spent on elections, right? And so there is certainly variation, and I'll be the first one to say that a race in California is going to look different than a race in maybe Vermont, but more money is being spent. And so, if you might be thinking, why should we care about state legislatures? Which I hope that is not your thought as a land grant institution. But if you need a motivation here, the main one here is to think that about state legislatures being the pipeline to congressional office, right? And it is important to understand how and to whom money is flowing for candidates to fund campaigns. So I think there's an important story here to be told about where money is coming from. And so what I'm showing you here is just average total receipts, right, across men and women. And so we see some differences here, right? Of course, these are averages and not the beautiful and nice models that political scientists like to show. But what I'm showing you here is that across all groups, we can think about differences around average total receipt for all groups, but across all groups, where most of the money is coming from is from PACs, right? If we look to this slightly darker area here, for most groups, their money is coming from political action committees. And you might be thinking, why is this a story that matters for if we're talking about who's running and pipelines and programs, etc.? Well, many of these groups, at least if we're talking about women, are women-focused groups who are on one hand doing some training and on the other hand doing some funding. So there's a story here to be told about how groups matter, or funding groups matter for women's chances in particular, especially when we know that women are less likely to run, right? So with that being said, with that being said, I give you a look in 2012 and 2014 around which groups are doing the funding. And notice there are a lot of lists here, right? And many of these are at the state level, but what stands out the most is Emily's list, right? And so the point that I want to make today as I am finishing up data collection, right, is that Emily's List is not the only game in town anymore, right? There are a number of other groups that are not just focused on women and also not focused in one ideological direction. There are also groups that are coming up that are focused on Republican women at the state level and are thinking about how do they fund women, right? But I think this also raises a question about how much PACs are in our lexicon or in the story about who was able to run more generally. We know that's where the money comes from for the most part, right? On average, that's where most of the money is coming from. And so there's a question in the story here about how much groups are mattering and also how do women focused groups, women funding groups are fitting into the story when they are doing the funding on one hand and the training on the other. And so as we think about next steps and try to get to a place of parity, we know these groups matter. There's also a question of how they think about who is able to do well, right? Challengers here are not the ones who are necessarily getting the money, right? It's the open seat elections, right? But I can give you a bit of hope here, right? That it's not among, if we're talking about PAC money as it relates to Black women, Black men, and white women, right? It's not among incumbents and challengers that we're really telling a different story, right? It's around open seat elections where we start to see a difference here, right? Black women who are high level participators, but often not coming from communities that are well funded or necessarily having the resources, they are the ones who are benefiting here from this story of PACs. But more generally, if we think specifically about women focus groups, there's a story to be told here about how much they matter and how the game is changing as more groups are coming onto into our lexicon, onto the field, color of change, right? Uh, Sorry, I'm forgetting Susan B. Anthony's List, etc., right? That are doing some work in funding. They may not be at the level of Emily's List, but they're certainly trying to do the work of bringing more candidates into the game. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Jamil, and thanks to all three of you for these amazing presentations. I learned a lot about what we did know and how things are changing, how they're evolving moving forward. I think we'd love to open it up now for a little Q&A from the audience. So I'm receiving questions here. If you're in the audience and want to ask one of these women questions, please just put them in the question box and I'll direct them to the appropriate panelists. So we have one question from the audience that I'll open up to all three of you, that's asking about sort of basically suggesting that women have largely closed the gender gap in business, largely if not completely, and wondering if essentially that growth and opportunities in business is causing a talent ambition shift away from public office. And so whether women are sort of turned off by the political world and seeing more opportunities and sort of other career paths to gain wealth, to sort of do other things. And you know, have you seen any evidence of that, Jen?
No. Let me elaborate in like 15 seconds though. So a couple of things. The first is in our studies, so for 2001, 2011, and 2021, a quarter of our sample were business people. So if we were going to see a shift at the aggregate level, we would have enough of them. There are thousands in these samples where we would have seen it also among our potential candidates. The other thing that I would note that I think is really vital here is that we asked people about their attitudes toward the electoral environment on a range of campaign activities. We also asked them about their satisfaction with the government. We asked them about the sort of mood of the country, and we asked them about their own job satisfaction. And on all of those indicators, there were no gender differences. The overwhelming majority of people hate politics. The overwhelming majority of people are dissatisfied with the direction the country is going in. And the overwhelming majority of people want to throw up in their mouths when they think about throwing their hats into the ring in a serious way. The issue is that last gap is bigger between women and men than all of those other ones.
Thanks, Jen. That's both depressing, but helpful. Good.
Can I just add though, I would question the notion that we've reached parity in business. We have reached parity in women graduating with MBAs, like we've reached parity in women graduating with JDs. None of that has meant that we have equal numbers of women in any kind of significant way staying around in business or law. We have an incredibly leaky pipeline, and we have still glass ceilings, especially at the higher levels of business and higher level of law firms, such that there's still incredible male dominance despite the kind of growth of women going into these fields. What we see is a lot of them end up leaving or staying at lower levels.
Can I add to the incredible points that have already been made that, when we think about this point of time in the pandemic, that many of the people who have left the workforce have been women, right? That we have to think about how motherhood matters, how caretaking responsibilities and how those roles are often put upon women, and how that matters for who was expected to take on the lion's share of home responsibilities and caretaking as we still deal with the ramifications of the pandemic.
That's a great point, the sort of pandemic dynamic that we're all still working with has really shifted things for a lot of people. I was wondering if we, sort of building on that point, if all three of you could talk a little bit about sort of, not just the burdens of the pandemic, but whether there's any sort of silver lining of the pandemic in terms of encouraging other types of candidates to run for office, people who hadn't previously experienced that. So, for example, here in Madison, we had a local chef run for office, sort of inspired by how hard the pandemic has been on the restaurant industry. Francesca Hong, she ran and was elected as the first Asian American in the Wisconsin state legislature. And so I was just wondering if you could talk about both sort of who's being negatively impacted on the one hand, and then sort of whether any of these difficult experiences are encouraging other people to sort of speak out into the political system.
Do you mind if I start? I had, because of your questions earlier, Ellie, I had looked some of this up. So UN Women and some other great groups internationally got together and did some data collection about the increase of work for women in the past 2 years. And I won't show you, they have, 20 pages of charts on this, but there has been a vast increase in women's unpaid household and care work, which is already vastly unequal. And I went to look also at, I don't know if you guys saw, I thought I'd share my own personal journey here, but this was a tweet that went viral from a climate scientist who was interviewed on CNN, and that's the left-hand panel, and later posted a picture that her husband snapped of her while she was doing that interview, because this was at the height of the pandemic and she had 2 kids and this is what her living room looked like. So she's trying to be kind of professional scientist on the left side. And the reality is that life has just gotten much harder, I think, for everybody, but it is, again, unequal. So for mothers in particular, for single mothers even more so, this was my morning, right? Trying to corral the dog and the toddler and to still get the slides done. It's just like life has just gotten much more difficult. I think it's harder to run for office. And at the same time, though, we've had an incredible bump in candidates. Maybe Jen can talk more about what we're seeing in terms of, there's been, I think, more women running, especially after Me Too and Trump. We have actually seen more women and women of color candidates, but I also think the barriers are increased.
I mean, let me just add a couple of points here. The first is, and this I guess is my good news, although during the pandemic, it's true that women probably absorbed additional household roles and responsibilities. If you compare 2001 to 2021, there's a substantial shift toward equity in terms of household arrangements and childcare arrangements. We're not at equity yet, we're not at parity yet, but we're way, way, way closer. The downside, because I'm always focusing on the downside, is that in 2001, 2011, and 2021, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter if you're married or single. It doesn't matter if you have kids or not. It doesn't matter if you have little kids or not. It doesn't matter if you're responsible for the majority of the household tasks or not. It doesn't matter if you're responsible for the majority of the childcare or not. If you're a woman, you're less interested in running for office. And so it's, I think, good for society that we're moving in a direction where we actually care about the household distribution of labor and unpaid labor in general. But in terms of closing the gender gap in political ambition, I don't think it's going to do anything. The other thing I would note is we supplemented our 2021 sample with 2,000 men and women who are just college graduates who work. So we moved outside of the 4 professions. And I'm excited to tell you that the gender gap in political ambition is 16 percentage points. So exactly the same size. So, expanding the scope might bring in a more diverse array of candidates, but it's not going to disproportionately funnel in more female candidates.
All right, thank you all so much. I know we're running a little short on time. Let's bring into our discussion some of these amazing leaders who are actually running some of these candidate recruitment programs to hear a little bit about what they've been doing and what their experience is. So I'd love to introduce our 2 real world leaders in candidate recruitment training. So first we have Erin Los Cutraro. She's the founder and CEO of She Should Run, which if you're not familiar with it, it's a leading nonpartisan organization working to increase the number of women running for office in the United States. Since its founding in 2011, over 40,000, yes, that's 40,000 women have been encouraged to run for office through She Should Run's efforts. We also have joining us Dr. Tina Pierce. She's a program manager in the John Glenn College of Public Affairs at Ohio State University, and she directs POWER, which is Programs for Ohio Women Empowered to Represent, which aims to increase the impact of women in politics and advance women's leadership through regional, national, and local events and programs for women's office holders, candidates, and campaign operatives. So I'm so thrilled to have you both here. It's really such a pleasure to have both you practitioners here joining us. Erin, could you lead off with some of your remarks?
Happy to do so, and I will share screen. A couple of notes. One, I'm just grateful to be part of a conversation that I'm actually so close to. So I am coming at you from Milwaukee, right around the corner here, and I am the founder and CEO of She Should Run. Can you see my screen? Great. Okay. What I truly am like on the edge of my seat through this conversation. I have to just offer so much gratitude to the incredible minds and time and talent it takes to do the research that has just been laid out and the years and years of research. It's truly, for me, the reason that I do the work that I'm doing at She Should Run. I did not come from traditional politics. I actually got into politics after being in education and then ultimately going into the corporate sector and then made a turn into politics. And I worked in electoral politics for a while. And it was, in fact, some of the research that was cited today that inspired me to create She Should Run. What I saw in the work that I was doing that was tremendously important in supporting women who were essentially trying to prove their viability to electoral kind of the big players was just cycle after cycle, we weren't seeing the progress that I felt like, God, there has to be another angle to this. And what I saw in the research, which you've heard, is that there's a lot of work to be done that needs to focus on ambition gap, that needs to focus on this pool of women who are not yet even thinking about running for office. And that's what She Should Run does. I will not go through stat slides because this has been laid out for you already. But know that, She Should Run, the work that we do in our organization, which is a nonpartisan organization that I'm proud to be nonpartisan, is really focused on reaching women where they are to help bring them to the starting line. So I'm a super visual person. And by the way, Zoom this has been like so hard for me for 2 years to not be able to walk around a room. But if you picture a funnel, the making of a candidate, and you'll see it in a later slide that I have, She Should Run sits at the very top of the making of a candidate. We're focused on the women who aren't there. We're focused at, sometimes we talk about being lead finders for the field. There are tremendous organizations that support women who are ready to go, who, need all of the support that was just laid out once they've made the decision to run. But how are we getting them there so that we can accelerate our ability to close this gap on representation? So I'll skip over the stats because that. Something that is really interesting to me in our work is that we focus on super big picture here, in that we know how many women there are, 167 million women in the United States. And then we get pretty technical in our numbers of thinking about, okay, from that, how many women are there who who care about causes, who would be potential targets to make a case for representation compared to how many women are actually in office. And I'm sure you will not be surprised to know that that number is huge, 64 million women in the United States that, that we want to make the case to. And women aren't a monolith, so that case doesn't look the same for every woman from every background and every experience. So here's like a kind of a version of the funnel in slide form here. This is imperfect, but we think about often the kind of the stages that it takes to make a candidate. If you start all the way at the point, at the bottom rather, where someone is an elected official and you work your way up, they're on the ballot, they know they're going to run, you go all the way to the top. Again, this is where She Should Run sits. It's like that woman who can't see herself running. It's what we're talking about, those ones who are like, no, or that thought hasn't even come into their minds just yet. We do our work by doing a few things. So we make a case, which is super interesting. We make a case and we're playing around. We're actually in the field with research right now to play around with some of the motivators for women around, there's so much talk around underrepresentation and not as much talk around what are the benefits, like why do this? And I know some of that was discussed today, but truly today in this like incredibly challenging environment for women, especially for some segments of the population, why would someone consider this? And if we're just hitting them with stats about why they're underrepresented, why they're not at the table, we're like solidifying this idea that it's not possible. And so, some of our work is around, a heavy piece of our work is around messaging. We have two primary goals as an organization. One is around this piece of like wide scale, making the case for elected office. And then our programs as an organization, which primarily operate in the virtual space, are around shifting mindsets. We talk about it as cultivating consideration, but we're basically trying to move a woman from a place of no, not me, to a place of possibility, so we can offload, hand over that woman to, we're part of a few coalitions, hand off that woman to organizations that can be incredibly supportive on candidate training and beyond. So we do a lot of leadership development, a lot of helping women imagine the possibilities and doing so in a way that really speaks to women from different backgrounds. That's, a big picture. That's what we do. A lot of our work is done in the space of building partnerships with organizations that speak to wide audiences, where we can insert a conversation around elected leadership and the value of that, and then cultivating those women in our community. And I'm thrilled to be part of the conversation today.
Thank you so much. It's just an amazing work in terms of scope and scale and everything you're doing. Tina, can you, yeah, there you go. Thank you so much.
All right. Can everybody hear me? Excellent. And how is this displaying on your screen? Are you just seeing the first slide that says empowering women? You're seeing the whole deck?
Presenter view, yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll just run through this way if we can make it larger, and we'll go that way. So again, thank you all for having me. I'm very appreciative of the opportunity to share the great work that we are doing here at the John Glenn College of Public Affairs. So our program was established more than 20 years ago in the Department of Professional Development. And here at the John Glenn, our mission in that department is to really help individuals build up the skills and the education that they need for upward mobility in their industries. And that's whether it's education or technical assistance. And so our team includes a number of individuals, including myself, another program manager, as well as a faculty member that kind of serves to help develop our curriculum, and a executive director. We have a number of different programs that are related to training, that are related to individuals earning certificates, as well as in-career degree programs. So given the type of work that we were doing, we felt that it was critical and necessary for us to focus on programs that will empower women to represent and run for office in the state of Ohio. And so through that, we have 5 key programs that we have implemented to ensure that we're helping to spread the good news and to invite and encourage, empower women to run for office here in the state of Ohio. And so you have our power programs. And so in essence, the Glenn College provides leadership training for students, for women who are in careers, for individuals that are ready to run for office, work on political campaigns, and serve as leaders and advocates in their communities. From township trustees to Ohio State House Power alum are running for elected office and winning. That's the good news here in the state of Ohio, that our candidates, once they go through our trainings, they're actually winning, and they're doing a great job representing. Power programs are open to any person who wants to use his or her voice to influence change and support diverse voices in elected office. Now, this is important that you all note that in not just my remarks, but in our programs, we invite all individuals, as you can well imagine with Title IX, often not just programs such as ours that are situated in institutions, but programs that are situated in higher education institutions throughout the country are often challenged on programs that are focused solely on women. And so we invite and we also empower men that come to our programs and participate as well. So it's very important to know that we understand that we want to provide space and place for women and men to have dialogue about those issues. So when our women are ready to run for office, they know how the men are going to respond. They've been able to have critical dialogue. So it's ironing, sharpening iron in many ways. One of the key things that we did to establish our programs is first, we centered them on relationships. And so we have ambassadors that network and establish strong relationships with potential participants and donors while sharing opportunities for growth. So we first have our Power Commission. This is a group of 10 women who are established leaders who guide power, mentoring, advocacy, fundraising, and our strategic direction. We also have Ignite, which is our student-led organization that empowers young women to develop political ambition. So in essence, we have individuals that are stepping out into our community on a daily basis, sharing the good news, sharing information about our programs. And then we also have those individuals doing the heavy lift of inviting people to donate funds I apologize. I'm not sure what happened with the internet connection just now, but I will say we're in Ohio and we had a pretty bad snowstorm yesterday and we're still digging out of it. So again, I want to encourage anyone who's thinking about starting a program, again, to think about ways that you can locate brand ambassadors, again, to serve as individuals that are sharing the good news about what you're doing. The second step I would also encourage individuals is to come up with a list of potential donors. What we find is that fundraising, your work really hinges on fundraising. You need to have people who are willing to get on the phone and make the calls to get money in the door so you can do these programs. And while there's not a one size fit all, again, having that potential list of donors and having some brand ambassadors that are out there singing your praises will help you tremendously. Earlier, I mentioned that we have a faculty member. We have a variety of faculty members that also serve and help as moderators, as facilitators, as presenters. They help to build institutional support. And that's important as well, making sure that you have that institutional support, that you're connecting with other colleges throughout your university. And in essence, it is really, again, relationship centered, because we focus on collaborative partnerships where we have meaningful partnerships where individuals are gaining something not just for their institution, but also being able to encourage women to run for office. Our programs then that we have are very key and critical in helping us to, again, move forward with helping to empower women. And so the three key programs that I wanted to focus on today are our Women of Power Networking Reception, our New Leadership Summer Institute, and our Ready to Run campaign training. And so with our Women of Power Networking Reception, that is our annual opportunity, again, to get people in the room, to encourage them to, again, donate and participate in our programs. Our New Leadership Program is a week-long training where we bring college students from throughout the state of Ohio to learn about the great work that we're doing to help them build those skills and that education that they need so they too can run for office in the future. They are connected with current office holders at the Women of Power reception. So again, we have those two groups coming together to meet one another, again, iron sharpening iron. And with our Ready to Run campaign training, that's a one-day training where we bring, again, individuals who are interested in running for office, are advocating for issues together, and we equip them with the skills that they need to be successful. And I know we're running out of time, so I will say that in short, what we've done here at the Glenn College of Public Affairs is to establish a three-pronged approach, again, using tools and education and skill development resources to help individuals not just get the skills and education that they need to be successful, but to also provide them with networking opportunities. And we implement this three-pronged approach on 4 levels: at the grassroots level, at the college level, with target populations, and then also with our elected and appointed officials.
Thank you so much, Gina. I know we're running a little bit short of time, but I thought before we wrap up this session, I would just ask you both about sort of what's changed in your work over the course of the pandemic. What are both the challenges, which of course we've all experienced in various forms of our life, but what are also the opportunities that you're seeing, and sort of how are you sort of thinking about moving forward in your work?
I think one of the great things that we've been able to do is really capitalize on COVID-19, and capitalize in terms of, we all understand that it is possible to work remote now, and we can meet working mothers and working individuals where they are. So we moved from only accepting, upward to 40 to 50 participants in our cohorts for our programs, to now accepting upward to 200 and more individuals. So we're training more women and preparing them for the opportunity to serve our communities.
Wow,
and I'll add to that. So similarly, around changes in the way that we operate, it shifted how we do our programs. It shifted the importance of us as an organization. She Should Run focused on more sophisticated data management systems. Because we're serving a wider audience, we actually saw an uptick over the last couple of years of women coming into our programs, and women from all sorts of backgrounds. And it's allowed us to get a little more targeted in what we're serving up to them. It's taken a lot of investment, and it's certainly, everyone is text, including, teams working at all levels, including in nonprofits. It is a hard time to get work done, but we're seeing the interest in our community, and so we're showing up for it.
Well, thank you so much to all of the panelists from this first half. I've learned so much, and I just feel so grateful that you've all come and joined us and shared all of your wisdom and research and experience. And I'm just in awe of all the amazing work that you all are doing. So thank you so much. We really deeply appreciate it. With that said, I'm going to hand the reins over to Barry Burden, who will lead things off for our next set of panels.
Thanks, Ellie. We're moving right along into our third panel. This will go back to a set of academic researchers I'll introduce in just a moment. They're going to be looking at who runs for office and who wins office, particularly at the local level. Very brief introductions for our three experts. Longer bios for them are provided on the Thompson Center website. First, Adam Bonica, an associate professor of political science at Stanford. His research includes the study of money in politics, campaigns and elections, judicial politics, and the methodology of studying politics. He has a PhD from NYU and has published that research in journals, including the American Journal of Political Science and many others. Chris Warshaw will be up next. He's an associate professor of political science at George Washington University. He has both a PhD and JD from Stanford. His work is primarily on political representation, particularly at the local level. He has a new book forthcoming with Devin Cohey titled Dynamic Democracy from University of Chicago Press. He too has published in the best journals in political science, the American Political Science Review, and others. And finally, Michael Zurob is a political scientist currently working as a research advancement manager at Meta. His interests are in local policing and policy. His research investigates political institutions and elections and how those shape street-level interactions between citizens and government. He earned his PhD just last year from Harvard University. So welcome to our group. I will turn it over first to Adam.
Well, thanks, Mary. First, I just want to say what an incredible set of presentations to follow up here. I think this is just some of the most important work being done in American politics, and then also some of the most important work being done helping improve representation. And so I'm going to be talking about money in politics in a way that follows up a little bit on what we've seen so far. And focusing on sort of the exclusionary sort of effects or consequences of the way that politics really runs on money in the United States. So we often talk about the distortionary effects of money in politics. And we can think of those as sort of the ways in which money influences the information, beliefs, behavior, or even the allocation of time of elected representatives through donors and lobbyists. But there's also another incredibly important consequence of the way money operates in American politics, and this has to do with the types of potential candidates that are excluded from access to representative office because of the many sort of financial barriers that exist when one is thinking of running for office. And so some of these costs come from just the cost of running for office being very costly in terms of time and may take away effort from putting food on the table if you're not from an affluent household. But it also has to do with these challenges with fundraising. And to give a sense of sort of how these sort of representational imbalances emerge, we can look at different groups that actually have pretty significant advantages in the fundraising sphere. And where fundraising is really important is very early on in the campaign. So the first sort of 3 to 6 months after you've declared that you're going to run for Congress, for instance, your fundraising success during that stage really sets up the rest of your campaign. And it's incredibly important in terms of who wins the primaries in particular, which is where we're doing most of our candidate selection, right? And once you go to the general election, you're usually in a district that we already know which party is going to win, but it's the primary in those districts and those safe seats, which comprise the majority of seats in the United States right now, where we're actually selecting what types of candidates we want to see represented in office. And so one thing you can see really quickly is that candidates are drawn from a very narrow slice of the electorate. So this bar is showing what the electorate looks like. Candidates, people who have decided to actually run for Congress, lawyers and doctors are heavily overrepresented. You can see that their share of the bar has grown dramatically. But then we have this other step of these are people who decided that they're interested enough in running for politics and have enough ambition to do so. Then if you move on to who wins elections, well, lawyers do even better and take up an even almost 50% of Congress. which is highly unusual compared to other advanced democracies. The Netherlands, for instance, only has one lawyer in their entire parliament. And so these barriers exist both in sort of who's deciding to run for office, but once you do, there's this early fundraising stage that's incredibly important in explaining who wins in the primaries. Another way you can sort of see this is looking at just sort of educational backgrounds of candidates. And educational backgrounds tend to map on pretty well to some professions. So like law degrees, medical degrees, MBAs within business, PhDs within in academia. But what this graph is showing is the relative odds of being both a candidate and a member of Congress. And so relative to the population, the main thing you can see here is that lawyers, for instance, are way out of whack with the rest of the population. So to put this in perspective, we often talk about how overrepresented millionaires are in American politics. And so millionaires relative to the average citizen are 10 times more likely to be elected to Congress. Lawyers, by comparison, are 100 times more likely. So lawyers are overrepresented an order of magnitude more so relative to even millionaires. And this has a lot to do with their lawyers' ability, especially to fundraise early on. What this is showing is looking at fundraising during the first 90 days of a candidacy. So like very early on in the stage, you rely heavily on what's called the 3 Fs, friends, families, and familiar. And this basically means that people you know are the ones who are going to donate to your campaign early on. And this, for lawyers, they have a pre-built fundraising network. This is also true for doctors and much to a lesser extent for PhDs, right? PhDs are not well represented, for instance, in Congress relative to their size of the population. And they're not very good fundraisers either. And so lawyers really stand out in the stage. And one of the things that's happening is because we have this fundraising system, we have to rely on people you know early on. Having a pre-built fundraising network that you can tap into is hugely advantageous. And just to sort of give perspective of what it looks like when you're running for office as a lawyer, if you go to an elite law school, for instance, and this is part of the reason why Jen and Shauna were talking about the importance of looking at lawyers as a population that are very likely to run for office. Well, one of the things that's happening is that there's sort of this catapult effect that if you are a lawyer and you run for office, you can go back and look at, and this is sort of a comparison of like how much the average graduate of these law schools have given to politics. Remember, only about 1 in 20 individuals in the United States actually donate significant amounts of money to politics. But for elite graduates of these law schools, the average amounts are ranging in almost up to $10,000. And so if you're a lawyer, you can access these sort of deep pockets that are in your sort of your own network. And it's not something that's accessible to the vast majority of the population. And going to the point that the importance of early fundraising, well, it not only matters in terms of winning the primaries, but if you were lagging behind your opponents in fundraising during the early fundraising stage, the probability that you're going to drop out of the election before you even get to the primary contest, so drop off the ballot, is significantly increased, right? But it also determines who wins as well. And there's not much evidence that voters, for instance, prefer to elect lawyers. In fact, voters seem to penalize someone who is a lawyer slightly. They're not selecting on them, but lawyers tend to get past this primary stage primarily because they have access to these fundraising networks, and same with doctors as well. And so this is another hugely sort of distortionary element of American politics that really does distort the types of people who get represented in office. And there are very clear downstream effects for gender and representation by race as well. These professions I talked about, lawyers and doctors, have not been the most inclusive historically. This has gotten a lot better in the last few decades, but it had really served as a gatekeeping or a gatekeeping process up until relatively recently. So I'll just conclude with this sort of this quote by Rahm Emanuel. The first third of your campaign is money, money, money. The second third is money, money, money. And the final third is votes, press, and money. This is it. So early fundraising really matters. And it really is a huge deterrent for more equal representation in the United States. So I'll pass this on here. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Adam. It's fascinating and worrisome stuff. I can see the lawyer effect, but there's also a Harvard law effect. It seems really special on top of all of the other law schools represented. Let's keep moving on. Next up is Chris Warshaw. Chris.
Everyone, so I'm really happy to be here. This has been a terrific set of presentations and discussions so far, and I've really learned a lot. And I'm glad that the University of Wisconsin is organizing this. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk today about some preliminary evidence from ongoing research that I'm doing on local government elections as part of my sort of larger research agenda on representation in state and local governments. And before I dive into some of the details, I'll just make the broader pitch that local governments are really, really important, both for determining the pipeline of candidates to Congress and to national offices. But I think they're also really important in of themselves. For most Americans, much of our experience with government is via city and county governments or local schools. I have 2 young kids in school and in public school. And so for me, like much of my experience with government is vis-a-vis the local public schools and other aspects of local government. And that's true for many Americans. So I think understanding elections and the representational and political process in state and local governments is really important. So one of the barriers for research on state and local governments, but local governments especially, has been the lack of systematic data on elections, both who holds office, but also who runs for office and how they do. So over the past couple of years, I've been working with some collaborators to build a data set of local elections and candidacies for local offices across the country over the past couple of decades. So what we've done is we put together data on something like 100,000 candidates in 50,000 contests in a wide variety of different offices, from mayors to city councils to county executives, county legislatures, and so on. And the fun part about the project has been that we, in addition to gathering the raw election data, we've also augmented that with a lot of data, both on their partisanship in places that are officially nonpartisan. It turns out that most people still are partisans in many ways, and but also their gender and their racial or ethnic group, so that we can start to get a sense of how the pool of candidates and office holders looks like in local governments based in a wide variety of different dimensions. So this has yielded, I think, a variety of interesting insights that hopefully are synergistic, but I think are very synergistic with some of the things that we've already heard. And I agree with a lot of the earlier presentations. So one thing that we found looking across all of these local offices is that there's a lot of uncontested races. So there's a lot of cases where voters can't choose from multiple candidates. So, this isn't a particularly profound point, but voters can only vote for the candidates that run for office. And if you only have one candidate that runs for an office, then you can only select that candidate. If the only candidates that run are 2 white men, then it's hard to get a non-white male candidate from the perspective of a voter. And there's lots of, I think, problems in the pipeline of candidates in local offices. But one particular problem is that many races are uncontested. So even mayoral elections that are, top of the ticket that matter a lot in many places are uncontested. And the problem gets worse in general as you go farther down ballot. And it's particularly for sheriffs and prosecutors. Close to a majority of sheriffs are uncontested in our data, and a majority of prosecutors are uncontested. So obviously, it's very difficult for voters to select a high-quality candidate, and particularly to select somebody other than a white male if the only candidate that runs is a white male. So I think this is, one basic problem in the pipeline of candidates in local offices. And I'll talk about a couple sort of representational consequences, I think, of these basic issues in the pipeline of candidates. So one is that there's a profound underrepresentation of non-white racial and ethnic groups. So what we did is we tried to compare averaging across the country, what percentage of mayors are from various groups and compare that to their percentage of the population. So if 10% of the population on average is say Black, then we would hope that 10% of the mayors are Black, and so on for other groups. And what you see is across different racial and ethnic minorities, they're underrepresented compared to their share of the population. That's true across offices, across basically every single office. But it's particularly true for sheriffs and some of the more down ballot offices. School boards are, vastly underrepresent Hispanics, for instance. And I should say Hispanics and Asian Americans are actually, in many of these cases, even more underrepresented than Blacks. So there's no simple, there's not like any of these groups are particularly well represented, and the underrepresentation is consistent across offices. Another thing, going back to something that we talked about with Jen's presentation and some of the others, is that the underrepresentation of ethnic minorities is really only slightly improving over time. I'd say for Asian Americans, it's improving, but it isn't really improving at all for Hispanics, and is barely improving for Blacks, and even there, there's heterogeneity across offices. Another thing we've looked at is underrepresentation of women. And so what we find is that women are underrepresented in the pool of candidates across every single office. The only one where women get close to parity in the percentage of candidates are school boards, and that's really only in recent years. Among school board people, women seem to do better than men in school board elections. So among the people that are actually elected to school boards, women are actually a majority. But in every other office, barely a third or less of the winners are women, and generally fewer than that percentage of the candidates are women. The representational inequalities are particularly bad for sheriff and prosecutors, where, for sheriffs, like 90% of them, of the candidates are men. And, I think that, as we talked about in the other presentations, the underrepresentation of women is slightly improving over time. But outside of school boards, so you have to sort of peek really hard at the data to see really sharp increases. And I'd say across all offices, really, women continue to be underrepresented in the pool of candidates for local offices. Another issue that I want to talk about is the ideological polarization of the candidate pool. So this is something that Adam's worked on, and many other scholars have done, really great work on. So here, but something I want to point out is that most Americans are ideologically moderate, and Americans tend to prefer moderate candidates. So what lots of research has found is that the main problem we have ideological polarization in Congress, one of the main reasons we have so much ideological polarization in office holders, is really the polarization in the candidate pool. It's not that voters prefer ideologically extreme candidates. Most Americans are actually quite moderate, as these graphs for some ongoing work I'm doing on using survey data shows. But we see among local candidates is that this is the CF scores based on some work based on Adam Bonica's data of county legislative candidates. And what you see is that there's a really wide gap between Democrats and Republicans that has grown over time. And I think that this polarization in the pool of local candidates then manifests in what we see in Congress. That, this is a graph of the nominate scores, which is a measure of the ideological polarization of members of Congress based on their roll call votes. And here you see that the polarization in Congress is increasing dramatically over time. But that shouldn't be surprising, given that the polarization in the pool of local candidates is also increasing over time. So it's not a Congress-specific phenomenon. And the last thing I'll close with, as terms of thinking about the consequences of this partisan polarization in the pool of candidates, is some argue that partisanship doesn't matter very much at the local level. But one of the things that I found sort of across a variety of different work is that partisanship is really important at the local level, and maybe a little bit, only slightly less important than it is in state and national politics. And what you see here is that, so these graphs are showing the ideal points of members of Congress and state legislators on the top. And these are pretty familiar for political scientists, that there's a wide gap between Democrats and Republicans, even in places that have very similar preferences of the mass public. What you see is it looks pretty similar in city governments. So in New York City, the gap between Democrats and Republicans in the same constituency is basically as large or larger in standardized terms as it is in Congress. And you see the same thing in Phoenix, Arizona, where we have members of the city council from both parties that represent similar constituencies. And it's something we found across in some early work across lots of different city and county governments, that there's a really wide gap between the roll call voting patterns of Democrats and Republicans, even in places with similar constituencies. And I think, again, this really comes down to polarization in the pool of candidates. So I think that in order for voters to have the ability to vote for candidates that represent us, whether it's more women, more people of different racial and ethnic groups, but also more ideologically moderate candidates, we need to broaden the pool of candidates to have more representation in that wider pool. So thanks for having me, and this is a really great set of talks. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Chris. I have so many questions for you, and the audience might too. I want to encourage the audience to use the question feature and submit those along the way. We'll try to work those in before the panel ends. But let's move ahead to our third presenter. That's Michael Zurob.
Great. Well, first of all, let me just say I'm really delighted and honored to be here today, and it's been incredibly interesting and refreshing to hear the presentations today. My presentation in some ways really complements Professor Warshaw's because it involves drilling down on one particular office, local county office, the county sheriff, that is in some ways has some distinctive features in the sense that it's an extreme case in some ways of the local offices, but also kind of can shed light on problems with candidate supply and pipeline issues more generally. So my presentation is called "There's Rarely a New Sheriff in Town," and it's based on electoral data I've collected on county sheriff elections for over the last few decades, about 5,000 or so from different states. All right, so some background and just sort of key takeaways that I'd like you to have from this. So the county sheriff is a county level office, which is important in some ways when you think about just recruitment and the pool of potential people who can run for the office. The median county in the United States is quite small, and there's one sheriff per county regardless of the county population size. So this is really overrepresenting non-metropolitan places. And of course, it's a law enforcement role. So it's an independently elected office that pertains specifically to a certain set of professional issues. Jails, which is probably the most widely shared feature of what sheriffs as law enforcement executives administer, but also very often more sort of run-of-the-mill visible policing like traffic patrol or responding to citizen calls for services. So, I mean, unsurprisingly, sheriffs tend to look like non-metropolitan law enforcement officers, which, as Chris's presentation pointed out, is really overwhelmingly male and overwhelmingly white. And because it's non-metropolitan disproportionately, these are, imbalances are even worse than, say, the policing profession as a whole. So this is an interesting class of offices, right? The sheriff is not the only office that has this kind of professional feature where the pool of candidates is sort of naturally limited to individuals with a certain professional background. I mean, a district attorney is also pretty similar. You have to be a lawyer, but there are, it's different from legislators. While certain professions are certainly overrepresented, there's not a clear analog between, being a member of Congress or president and having a particular professional background. And so that really narrows the pool of people who can run for these kinds of county offices. So who runs? Law enforcement officers disproportionately within the department that they're running. It tends to be deputy sheriffs running, although cities within, or from cities rather, within the county also tend to run for county sheriff. And who wins? It's overwhelmingly incumbents running and winning re-election. I mean, obviously not exclusively, but about 3/4 of the general elections in my data are incumbent races, and conditional running, 90% of the incumbents win. And they're increasingly co-partisans of the county. I say increasingly in it because for many decades, there was actually a pretty big divergence between presidential partisanship and local county sheriff partisanship in places with partisan sheriff elections. But this has really narrowed over time as nationalization of politics has sort of trickled down to these local offices. So just to visualize this a little bit in my data, similarly, you know, these tend not to be particularly highly contested offices, and the rates of contestation are higher among in races where the incumbents run for re-election, which is the majority of races. This is an interesting comparison between elected sheriffs and appointed police chiefs, who are kind of interesting analog to the county sheriff. Because unlike the sheriff, they are appointed by a mayor. The mayor can typically fire them wherever. This is a survey from many decades ago, but it kind of reflects results from, I mean, my impression from reading what other scholars have written about sheriffs and just a lot of their internal conversation, which is that sheriffs feel that their job is a lot easier than the job of police chiefs. In certain dimensions, like dealing with crime or facing support from the community, sheriffs and police chiefs tend to report similar, you know, issues with those problems. But with things like the extent to which you feel political pressure, sheriffs feel that this is much less of a problem than police chiefs do. I've read really, you know, there's some really interesting quotations from police chiefs talking about this, where they say basically they run for office every day because a police chief can fire them whenever, whereas sheriffs only have to run for office on the electoral cycle, and often those races are uncontested, and they hold a lot of advantages from being big employers in the county. So this is, I think, a really interesting comparison point when you think about the pipeline of people who become sheriffs and why they tend to stay in office much longer than their appointed counterparts who are police chiefs. So that's what this next plot shows. So the dashed line here represents the sort of median tenure of police chiefs, and then using the electoral data that I have and supplementing it with some other data on sheriff tenure, just able to look at the distribution of how long sheriffs stay in office. And you see these spikes around the 4-year electoral cycle. But, you know, the median sheriff stays in office for about, this dashed line is for the 11 years that the sheriffs stay in office for in general. Among police chiefs, this is much, much smaller than 11 years. It's around 2 or 3 years. And when there are national or local scandals around policing, as we saw around the summer of 2020, there's huge turnover among police executive leadership, appointed leadership, but the sheriffs tend to be a lot more stably situated. And that, I think, is you know, is due to the institutional nature of the office, that they're only accountable to voters, and voters only get to weigh in episodically with the electoral cycle, and even so, they often don't have anybody to choose from. So it's interesting. I mean, we're often thinking about why people run for office, and it's kind of relative to what's the counterfactual, what would they be doing instead? And the most obvious analogous situation, which is to be an appointed police chief, is in some ways much less desirable, which is perhaps why people who hold this office tend to stick around. And trying to switch slides here. Yeah, so as far as some takeaways for this local county office, it's an interesting example of an office because it is to such a great degree influenced by the professional backgrounds required. And so, you know, more than 95% of them are law enforcement officers, and they tend to be from within the departments that they serve. And incumbents tend to stay in office for a long time, which might reflect the relatively more desirable experience of holding this office than other feasible alternatives for people in this profession, like being a police chief. And also, I haven't been able to find systematic work on this, and haven't done any myself, but it's interesting to think about, you know, why and how often and for what reasons people who will hold the county sheriff's office run for higher office. And it doesn't seem to be particularly common, given that there are 3,000 or so of them, sheriffs, that is. There is at least one former sheriff who is a representative in Congress from a suburb of Houston. And there are, of course, a few other examples of candidates running. There are a couple running in 2022 for Congress, but it's not particularly common. And I think this reflects that it's really, if you're a person from this background, it is a desirable office to hold, and it is more desirable than other alternative offices that people from this background might hold. And it's certainly better than being a police chief, where you have a lot less control over your day-to-day job. So I think that sort of non-material feature of office holding and sort of thinking about not just how much office holders get paid, but how enjoyable the job is sort of for the kinds of people who are interested in running for it, is an interesting thing to think about more generally, about how it influences who runs for office and pipelines to higher office. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks to all three of you. And your final point about how enjoyable the job is does make me wonder about Adam's research on lawyers who, are in an adversarial occupation. They're arguing. And so to be in elective office maybe is not so unusual. But let me pose a general question to all three of you. We'll have to move kind of quickly to get to our last panel. But in the US, we think of there being a ladder of offices. It's really different than most other democracies, where we elect very local offices, and we think of ambitious politicians working their way up, often from being on the school board to state legislature to something else. And there's sort of an idea that that's a good idea because it allows people to dip their toes into a local office that's a bit less of a commitment, to get experience, and that maybe ought to breed some of the best people working up the food chain. But I think all three of your presentations are challenging that. Michael's suggesting that sheriffs don't really move on, and even looking to an appointive office as an alternative maybe is not successful. I think what I got from Adam's talk is that lawyers in some ways are jumping up the ladder because of their fundraising and other advantages, that maybe they're shooting for Congress first and skipping a lot of the lower offices. And Chris is just finding so many uncontested races, you actually don't see people willingly jumping into races. So I wonder if there's anything institutional you all would suggest for the offices you studied. Is there something about the length of the term or the salary or the size of the district, that makes it difficult to run, or something else that you'd encourage to really get good people and enough people to seek office? So if y'all want to say a word about that, Adam, you want to start?
So I think institutionally, one of the challenges that the United States presents is that we have such a candidate or individual-centric pipeline to office, that there are so many choices an individual has to make and so many sort of hurdles that they have to get over. Other institutional setups that exist in other democracies have a lot more party influence on who's selected to run for office. And so in the United States, I think some of the things that are really important are some of the work we saw presented today about helping train people run for office. I know that's not institutional, that's sort of outside of the institution, but I think that's incredibly important. And I think we need to, as a society, think more about trying to be more proactive about fixing these imbalances and the sort of disproportionate costs that exist for running for office. And some of the ways we could think about doing that is through political scholarships. So giving people the ability to take a year or two off from work to run for office. That's something you could do without having to change a law, right? You could just fund that through private or civil society. And so I think that, the United States presents these unique challenges in some ways. And so we have to be, without changing our institutions, we have to be really proactive in terms of helping more people run for office.
Chris or Michael?
And I think the main thing that comes to my mind is just the one institutional thing that can be changed, but it's likely unpopular, is the material rewards to office holding. I think Andy Hall's book, Who Wants to Run, is really the key reading on this. But a lot of local offices are unpaid or essentially unpaid. State reps, state senators, in some places are basically volunteer jobs. In some places, they're not volunteer jobs, but the kinds of people who tend to run would make so much more money doing anything else. And that really shapes the pipeline, I think. It prevents people from running, and yeah, I mean, that's, if there's one thing that could be changed, although I think it would be difficult to change, I think that's what it is.
And Chris.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think that these jobs generally are not great jobs in a lot of ways. So making them better jobs with better pay and less vitriol directed at these folks would clearly help. I also think that beyond this isn't directly related to the pipeline of candidates, but most of local elections are off cycle, and moving them on cycle, I think, would get a better, more representative electorate, which I think would help the candidate selection process. And I think that getting, as Adam was saying, getting interest groups and parties more involved in the candidate recruitment process. I think that a reform that was done like 100 years ago in many places of the country was to make local governments nonpartisan. And I think the academic research and the effects of that is like, it's very unclear the costs and benefits. But I think one of the big costs is that it does make candidate recruitment harder, because parties can't recruit party candidates if they're not involved in the elections officially. So I think making more elections partisan would sort of slightly, in a somewhat counterintuitive way, would I think actually help with the candidate selection pipeline.
Thanks to all of you. Lots to chew on here, but we're just going to keep skating along because we've got one more great panel to fit in. So let's turn our attention again. This final panel is talking to some professionals in the field and former candidates themselves, focused on candidate recruitment and training programs. 3 panelists here I want to introduce you to quickly. First is Aamina Ahmed, who's the Regional Program Manager with New American Leaders. She is, among other things, an alumnus of the New American Leaders Ready to Lead and Ready to Win programs. She most recently led the Asian Pacific Islander America Vote Michigan program. Seth Lin will be up next. He's Administrative Director at University of San Francisco at the MA program in Public Leadership, where he is teaching. He's a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, has a master's in public affairs from Princeton, and served in the Marine Corps. Most importantly for us, he's the founder and executive director of Veterans Campaign, a group focused on training veterans across the political spectrum to run for political office. And we'll end with Ron Nehring, who's the director of international training at the Leadership Institute. He previously served as chair of the California Republican Party for 6 years. He was national spokesman for the Ted Cruz presidential campaign in 2016 and was a candidate himself for lieutenant governor in California on the Republican side in 2014. He's a lecturer, speaker, and also election observer and consultant in countries around the world. So thanks to the 3 of you for being with us. And Aamina, you get the floor first.
Thank you so much for having me. Totally honored to be here, and I will share my screen. So I'm with New American Leaders, and what we do is we empower immigrants, refugees, and anyone who identifies with the immigrant experience to run, win, and lead. And so that means training them, then helping them as they're in the governance process as well. And so just a couple of images of some of the people who we work with. Now Mayor of Dearborn, Michigan, Abdullah Hammoud is a frequent speaker and someone who really champions New American Leaders. Shahana Hanif, who won her New York City Council election, is an alum from our Ready to Lead and Ready to Win programs. And similarly, there's over 1,300 alum now across the country. Here's just, you can see some of the representatives in Maine, in Portland, Maine. There's a very vibrant Somali community, and we've been able to help train some people there who have subsequently won their elections. You can see Safiya Khalid in that image. Very briefly, Some of our trainings are called Ready to Lead and Ready to Win. The Ready to Lead training is our introductory training, which focuses on really a basic campaigns 101 and on values-based messaging. And what we find is that many times people who come into our Ready to Lead trainings don't actually see themselves as people who would run for office. We're very pleased when they leave the training, which is 2.5 days, thinking that, oh, this is something we could actually do. And sometimes they leave thinking, I'll help a cohort member win. But it's amazing in how short a time we can not only build community among the cohort, but also give them the confidence that they actually are the right person to run and that they can run and win. Ready to Win is focused on people who are planning to run in the near future. And that is bifurcated into people who are wanting to run as candidates, but also campaign staff. Because what we found was that alum from our program who wanted to run would get very frustrated when the only people they could find who had campaign experience were the same people they were contesting or the same kind of faces of representation that they were trying to challenge. And so we started a simultaneous kind of campaign staff or campaign operative pipeline. And these are just our social media handles. If you look at our Instagram in particular, we have a really great graphics and kind of short videos and things like that on Instagram. But that's just very briefly what New American Leaders does.
Thank you, Aamina. That's really helpful, and I appreciate you being brief to get us back on schedule. Let's turn to Seth next.
I almost wasn't ready, but I'll try to share my screen right now.
You're ready, Seth. I just figured we were running out of time, so I wanted to be brief and leave time for questions.
Absolutely, no, I appreciate it. So yeah, I'm Seth Lin, and I am, I guess I wear two hats here. I'm founder of Veterans Campaign and the director of the MA in Public Leadership program at University of San Francisco, and those are actually kind of two symbiotic things. The master's actually grew out of Veterans Campaign, which I'll explain in a sec. But the story really begins with me still in the Marine Corps at the time, and I was speaking with my then commanding officer, and who told me that it used to be that back in the day there were a lot more veterans in office, and that was a much better thing at the time. And the truth is, he was one of these sort of guys who had been in for 26 years, and everything was sort of better back in the day type of situation. But I began looking into this as a graduate student, and realized there had been this fairly precipitous drop in the number of veterans in Congress, and that you'd expect some of that given that the end of the draft, the all-volunteer force, and the fact that after World War II and Korea, just about everybody had served in the military, who was, at least at the time, you're talking about men running for office and men serving. But even as far as women, there are far fewer in the population now. But even controlling for that, there's been a big drop, and there's also been a sort of simultaneous drop in the country's confidence in Congress. And at the same time, there's also been an increase since Vietnam, at least, in the confidence that Americans have in the military. So I in no way am making the argument that the reason that we have lost confidence in Congress is that people are crying out for more veterans in Congress. But I do think there are certain things that veterans have traditionally brought to Congress that that are missing, or that people feel are missing from Congress. And just some examples of that is just selflessness in general. There's some evidence that veterans tend to be less quick to commit our military to conflict, but actually also once engaged will want to fight until the end. Additionally, there's just a tradition that shared military service can still transcend partisanship. Again, none of these things are always the case, but just in the aggregate, I think this is correct. That people tend to have very few things that transcend partisanship these days. Additionally, electing more veterans has been bringing more diversity to Congress in the aggregate, at least for the past couple decades. Voters tend to see the military as being somewhat above the fray and above partisanship. Is not always true, but that's a perception. And there is this integrity and leadership that voters tend to associate with the military. Now, what we've put together as building this program, basically, I started it as a graduate student, as I mentioned, and just I knew nothing about politics myself, but I was interested in it. And a lot of military folks, I think, would make great elected leaders, but have no idea where to start, because there's a bunch of really important laws in this country that make sure that you don't have the military involved in partisan politics. But that does put veterans at a bit of a disadvantage if they want to get involved. So we began with creating a candidate workshop, which then grew into a nonprofit. We wrote it was called the Candidates Field Manual. And then about 5 years ago, I was introduced to actually a University of Wisconsin former professor, Ken Goldstein, who helped me create this master's program at the University of San Francisco. And that's, I think, since then is when it's really taken off. We also have a certificate that we're launching in March. And lastly, I'll tease this real quick. This is for anybody here, including the non-military adjacent, but we are going to begin a cybersecurity training program with a big tech company. We haven't announced it yet, but that's something that I think everybody could use, is learning how to make your campaign safe from getting hacked. That seems to be increasingly a problem. But I'm going to talk about, just real quick, just go through some of the pitfalls we've seen that candidates face and sort of how we train them. One is, a lot of times people, whether it's intentional or not, maybe your staff will talk about your service record and not be entirely accurate about it. A lot of times the staffers don't understand the difference, but that can completely undercut a message. A lot of veterans come out of the military with no political experience. They just don't know what they don't know. And so they're convinced to run in races that are completely unwinnable. But they might think that they have a shot. Also, it tends to be, and this has been the case a lot more recently, that with the military being a bit more of a positive narrative than it had been prior to 9/11, at least, it was almost became the focus of the campaign. And voters tend to like it, but it's not usually going to be what makes them want to vote on election day. It's a positive, but they're going to care on election day about what's paying their mortgage, keeping their kids in school, that sort of thing. And lastly, there's a whole issue with veterans getting in trouble for if they're still in the reserves with having campaign photos in their uniforms, which is a no-no if you're still in. If it's called the primary graphic, and if it doesn't have a disclaimer that explains that this is not the it does not imply endorsement by the Department of Defense. So so those are sort of the issues that are specific to the military. There's also just issues that everybody needs to know, but are especially, I think, relevant to our audience. One is that, simply put, the veterans just aren't very good at fundraising. It just tends to be across the board. A lot of us haven't done it before. A lot of us are adverse to it just by nature. Additionally, it's difficult to explain what you've done for the past few years to a population that has less and less familiarity with the military, at least compared to 70 years ago, and often shooting too high. If you're talking to a bunch of teachers who want to run for office, they will generally understand the importance of local office. If you've been in the military for 10, 20 years, maybe you haven't really got involved in local office, but you've seen how federal office works, and they tend to want to run for Congress. And that's usually not a great place to start. I mean, it's shoot for the moon by all means, but it's just it doesn't always go too well your first round out. Just a quick look at how things have gone over time. You see that veterans have gone sort of coming on in waves, and I don't think we'll ever get up to where we were back around the Vietnam timeframe, but that's kind of a good thing, because that would probably mean that we've had another huge war, which we don't really want to have. All right, and just real quick, I'll just talk about why I think the numbers are going to rebound a little bit. One, I'll skip over this. The changing demographics of veterans. There's an idea that veterans tend to be old, white, and male. As someone who's two of those things, I can say that it still is somewhat true, but they're a lot more representative of the population as the candidates have gotten more representative of the population. Women over the last few cycles have really exploded. I haven't even put the most recent election on here because it's double what it was in 2018, which was the highest ever. So, we had literally 24 nominees who were women veterans in 2020. It's really exploding, and we as of a couple of years ago, women who served in the military were about 15 times more likely to be elected to Congress than women who didn't, at least among young women. And you'll see sort of from this is well, I'll skip over this actually, so I gotta save some time here. I'll just say that it tends to be that it used to be that the older cohorts in Congress were the most likely to have been in the military, and now it's actually the younger cohorts who are the most likely to have been in the military. That's sort of a striking thing. Another reason the number might be going up pretty soon. And I will skip over the partisanship slide and there. Try to keep us on time.
Thank you, Seth. All right, if you want to unshare, we'll move on to Ron Nehring. Ron, you're up.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to everyone at the University of Wisconsin for the opportunity to join you today. I'm going to share my screen. I hope you can all see that now. I come at this topic from a very practical perspective. I'm 51 years old. I got involved in politics at age 18 and have been involved ever since. Much of the discussion so far has really focused a lot on demographics and so on. And I just want to lead up front that my family didn't come from a history of political involvement whatsoever. My parents were German immigrants. They didn't speak English when they came to this country. And yet I've done some of the things that I've done. And so I want to walk through what some of the important qualities are for a successful candidate and then how training and educating candidates matches up with that. And none of this applies more or less to anyone from one demographic group or another, because in my history in politics, it doesn't matter. But there are other qualities that do matter. And the first of which is candidates need to have that fire in the belly. Now, can you train people to have a fire in the belly? Not really, but you can motivate people. And so motivating good people to run for office, I think, is an important thing that we need to have so that we have more better candidates running. So you don't have an imperfect market. We have a closer to a perfect market of lots of great people running. Second, successful candidates need to have a balance of ego, strength, and humility as well. If you take a look at this picture, these are all people who have something close to that balance of ego, strength, and humility. You have to have ego and strength in order to withstand some of the pressures that come from being a candidate. But successful candidates also should have a degree of humility, because without that, they can't learn, they can't improve. Candidates need to have a vision and be able to articulate that vision. And that vision needs to be a blend of both aspirational and practical. Candidates should have things that they can point to that they've accomplished in life. It's not only an ability to have a vision, but to demonstrate an ability to turn that vision into reality. One area where many female candidates have an advantage is that, and I realize that I have a former male candidate on the screen at the moment, but I find that many female candidates are better at conveying the qualities of caring and fairness. Jonathan Haidt discusses this at great length in his book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. Candidates need to convey that they have these qualities of caring and fairness. They need to be honest, not only in according to a court of law, but according to the standards of the court of public opinion, where the burden of proof is much lower. And then finally, candidates need to be seen as representing and epitomizing shared values in the community and have the ability to communicate that. Winning candidates also need to have the ability to build an organization, and this is an area where candidates can be trained in terms of how do you build that? How do you assemble a kitchen cabinet, a group of donors, et cetera, who will support you to build ties in the activist community as well. So having that strong organization and then supplementing that with a power base. And that is, if you're a candidate running, and after running for 6 months, if you can't draw a group of people together, then you're lacking something. Successful candidates need to have the ability to inspire and to build that power base of support that includes people in the activist community as well as donors. The ability to raise money. I strongly disagree with the notion that self-funders have some type of enormous benefit in politics. You know who loves self-funding candidates? Consultants, because self-funding candidates tend to pay all their bills on time and they don't quibble so much about the invoices. But the road to political oblivion is lined with the carcasses of self-funded candidates. And if you doubt that, I would point to Michael Bloomberg, who managed to win only the caucus in American Samoa, despite spending $100 gazillion. That's a little bit of hyperbole there. But many self-funded candidates are terrible candidates, and many self-funded candidates don't do the fundraising necessary because they feel they don't have to. But when you're raising money, you're also building relationships. You're giving other people a stake in your success. Politics is a people business. Again, I think that the discussion of demographics is way overemphasized. What's more important, in my experience, is someone a people person? Do they have skills? This is former San Diego Mayor Kevin Faulkner, a friend of mine. Do you get along with people? Do you smile when you talk to people? Do you know how to relate to people, et cetera? And those skills can be taught. Wonderful book by Jack Schaefer called The Like Switch, which I recommend every candidate read. Now let's talk a little bit about candidate roles and responsibilities and how that relates to training up candidates as well. These are not famous people, but these were my colleagues on the Cruz campaign. In the middle is Jeff Rowe, who's a general consultant. On the one side is David Polyansky, who was a strategist, as well as Chris Wilson, who was our data guy. Candidates need to be able to assemble a team of senior level people who can help to shape and to guide the campaign going forward. So candidate responsibility number one is they have to be able to build a team. Number two is they have to be able to motivate people and inspire people to volunteer to help them to give something which people don't have to give. And in many cases, people value their time even more than their money. Candidates need to have the ability to ask people to donate money to the campaign as well. The candidate is the best person to ask people to donate or to volunteer. And finally, to ask for votes. And one advantage that candidate Schwarzenegger, later Governor Schwarzenegger, had is that he knew how to do this, and he knew how to communicate. He knew how to inspire people. And then the final point that candidates need to be able to do is to keep themselves out of trouble, because ultimately it's only the candidate who can do that. They need to keep themselves out of trouble, and they need to keep their distance from anyone who might affiliate with the campaign, who might get them into trouble. I would sum this up as saying that candidates need to be strong in three areas. And again, this is where I think much of the political science field misses the boat, in that there's such an emphasis on the political spectrum and moderate and conservative and so on and so forth, that I think it overlooks that philosophy and ideas and where you are on some political spectrum, which, by the way, is largely useless. Where do you put a candidate, or where do you put a voter who cares about climate change and cares very much about high taxes? Or they tend to get lumped in as a moderate, even though they're moderate on either one of the issues that I just said. So an over-reliance on the political spectrum, I think, is a handicap. Candidates are strong when they're strong in three areas: their philosophy and their ideas, and that is they can present solutions to the problems that people are facing in their lives. The second, and what is more important in my experience, is the narrative, the identity of the candidate. What have they done with their lives? What type of story can they tell that brings them to the table? And I think that's where the discussion about veterans can be particularly powerful in particular districts. And the third area is in their skills. They need to have the ability to organize, to communicate, and so on. We have plenty of candidates who might have great ideas, but have a terrible story, or have a great story, but their ideas are out of sync with the district and they couldn't organize a political campaign to save their lives. Candidates are strong when they're strong in these three areas. In my day job, I work for the Leadership Institute, which is a nonprofit that was set up in 1979. We don't do policy, we train people in how to be successful in the public policy arena. So we have a future candidate school to train candidates. We have schools to train people who work on the campaign at the senior level that you can see on the screen, and also programs to prepare activists and volunteers to maximize their number and effectiveness. In all, we offer 51 different types of programs. You can see them all at our website, leadershipinstitute.org. Here's a couple of statistics. We trained about 12,000 people last year. All of our programs are open to the public. We don't care what what your demographic background is, et cetera, et cetera. We do have a mission of training conservatives, so we're thrilled when conservatives show up and train and take our programs. For those on the left, there are plenty of other programs there, other organizations that engage in that type of training. With that, that's probably the quickest I've ever gone through 25 slides. I hope you found that helpful, and I'll enjoy the Q&A. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you to all three of you. We're a little over time, so I'm going to ask what I hope is a quick question to get your take. One message I got from all three presentations, and actually the earlier panels, is what a human process this is. We're talking about people making decisions about whether to enter public life and to seek a campaign. And in some cases, they're underestimating their ability to do that. And in some cases, maybe with some veterans, maybe with Michael Bloomberg, they're overestimating where they should get into the process. And so many of these candidates are self-starters who are ambitious people who have done other things in life that make them confident, and it makes them jump into the pool. But I was struck in Aamina's discussion that there were people in her training program who were not intending to be candidates, but somehow were recruited to take part, and while they were there, began to convince themselves. So the arrow of order of events is sort of backwards there, and that you even had people training to be consultants or assistants, or the trainers who do the people who do the training are being trained themselves, and you're one of those graduates. So it just strikes me that the kind of tools or resources or recruitment that needs to be offered really varies depending on the office we're talking about. I think Ron was talking about higher level offices that do require all of these assets. And maybe for our other two presenters, we're looking at entering at a kind of lower place and working our way up through the ladder. So it's not exactly a question, but I'm just curious about your feedback on kind of the human element there and trying to match people to the right environment that's going to make them successful and help bring their voices into politics. So,
well,
Aamina,
if I could jump in on that real quick, I would just say that politics is 75% relationships, and it is 25% everything else. And I think that's a point that gets lost in many of the academic discussions. If you're a people person, if you make people feel good when you talk to them, et cetera, you might be astonished as to how far you can get in politics. It's not all an insider game. In my judgment, politics is the ultimate meritocracy, in that if you're good, if you work hard, and if you get along with people, you can do very well.
Aamina?
So I don't want to directly contradict, and there is definitely truth in what Ron is saying, but at the same time, we find that that's not always the case. So we do find that, for instance, people who have names that the voter base is not familiar with may struggle with that, because it's not a Ron or a John or a Jim or a Tom. And so the Aamina or the Safiya or the Abdullah, all of a sudden people may not be as familiar with those names and question who stands behind them. So it's not always about just the people person. All of those individuals could be very people, but the reality is that when people cast votes, it's not necessarily someone who's always come in contact with the candidate well enough to know who they are, right? And so in our training programs, we see what some of the researchers and academics talked about in terms of gender gaps, in terms of racial gaps. Those are very evident. And we also see that many times people with an immigrant background may not see themselves as part of the political process. And so in our training programs, we lay a great emphasis on actually empowering people to be able to see themselves in those roles.
Thank you. Seth, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I do think there's to Ron's point, it's not rocket surgery. You know, I mean, you look at the Supreme Court or some of the high level executive folks. It's you say, my God, like how could I ever get there if you're just starting out? If you frankly just meet a lot of members of Congress, they do seem kind of like regular folks, and that's a that's it's good and bad. It's supposed to be that way in a lot of ways. But I think that I guess what I'd say for other other organizations looking to recruit, what I've seen, this sort of ties into a couple different things we talked about, but I guess it was, I think Sean talking earlier about women at wanting to run, and what I found is with women veterans, it's you've had this interesting situation where all these different industries and sectors, women have been breaking through the glass ceiling recently. And in the military, it's the same way in a lot of ways, but it's also been, I think, probably a little bit less welcoming. And it's also been without the sort of financial reward at the end that you might get in business and some other sectors. And so you have this group of people who are willing to go into a difficult situation, and the reward being getting to serve your country and maybe getting killed. And that, I think, is a special kind of person that actually really works in the political field too, because you're not going to have, because we were just sort of saying before, we're not going to have a whole lot of financial reward there. It's sometimes can seem thankless, but you do get to serve your country, and that's an important sort of sub demographic to get to. That's how I'd answer that. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, well, these are hard questions to answer, but I think today we've at least asked them and brought some really smart, experienced people together. So I want to thank all of you on this panel and everyone who's participated today. This has been a fun and fast 2 hours. Thanks also to Alex Talk, who's director of the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership, and especially to Tia Westhoff, who you did not see today. She is the public relations coordinator for the Thompson Center and really made this happen from a technical perspective, organizationally, promotion, and everything else. So thank you to Tia for making it happen. If you're interested in the work that the Thompson Center or the Elections Research Center are doing, you can find both of our websites pretty easily through a Google search. We have social media accounts. You can follow along with our activities. The Thompson Center has some excellent upcoming events that may interest you. There's a series on leadership that involves a focus on the Cold War with former Prime Minister Mart Laar of Estonia on February 18th. Additional events on central bank leadership, questions of academic freedom, criminal justice reform, digital privacy, and a lot more policy topics. The Elections Research Center also has events in the hopper, including one next week on a Final 5 ranked choice voting reform in Wisconsin, at least the possibility of it, and looking at that. So thank you all again for your attention. Really appreciate you being with us. Have a great afternoon.